April 1917. Petrograd, night. There's a crowd on the platform, banners visible in the electric light, and somewhere in the center of it, a small bald man who has just stepped off a train after a decade away. The photograph isn't particularly dramatic. He looks unremarkable, honestly, slightly rumpled, compact, blinking in the glare. Nothing about the image announces that the world has just bent at a hinge. But it had. That man was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, and the decision to board that train earlier that April wasn't just a personal choice. The German military had put him on that train hoping to destabilize Russia. What they actually did was hand a loaded weapon to someone who already knew exactly what to do with it. Welcome to the Sleepy Biographer. Tonight we're spending time with one of the most contested, complicated, consequential people of the 20th century. Not a saint, not a simple monster. A man with a particular mind, at a particular moment in history, who moved faster than almost everyone expected, and left the rest of the century to reckon with the consequences. Get comfortable. This is a long story and we'll take it slowly. Let's start in 1870. Simbirsk, Russia, a town on the Volga that was large enough to feel like a place and small enough to feel like a limit. Vladimir Ulyanov was born there on April 22nd, the third of 6 children, into a family that had done something remarkable in a single generation. Climb from irrelevance to a class of somewhat noble stature. His grandfather on his father's side had been legally bound to the land, classified in Russian law as little better than property. His father, Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, had educated his way out, studied physics and mathematics, became a teacher, rose to become a regional school inspector, and received a hereditary title of nobility from the state. One generation, nobody to nobleman. It matters because the Russia that Vladimir Ulyanov was born into had only abolished serfdom in 1861, 9 years before his birth. The country was enormous, overwhelmingly rural, and the gap between those at the top and those at the bottom was among the largest on earth. The emancipation of 1861 had changed the legal category of tens of millions of people without materially changing their conditions very much. They were free in name. They were hungry in practice. The Ulyanov household was warm, literate, ambitious, books everywhere, conversation at the dinner table, high expectations for the children's education. Vladimir's mother, Maria Alexandrovna, reportedly of German and possibly partial Jewish heritage, though this is still debated by historians, was musical, intellectually serious, devoted. Vladimir finished at the top of his class. He was talented in Latin and Greek. He was, by all accounts, a composed and focused child. Then, in 1886, his father died. Heart disease. Vladimir was 15. He dealt with it. The family dealt with it. But something seemed to shift beneath the surface, quietly, the way shifts of that kind do, not visible until later, when you look back and trace the line. What happened next did not adjust quietly. His older brother Alexander was studying natural sciences in St. Petersburg. He was 21, idealistic, and had gotten involved with a group called the People's Will, one of the radical organizations that had been circulating through Russian-educated society since the 1870s. The People's Will had already assassinated Tsar Alexander II in 1881. By 1887, a small cell of the organization, including Alexander Ulyanov, was planning another assassination. Tsar Alexander III this time. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out. Alexander was arrested. He was tried, convicted, and offered mercy if he would cooperate and name associates. He refused. He was hanged in May 1887. He was 21. Vladimir was 17. There is a story, possibly true, possibly shaped in the retelling, that when Vladimir learned of Alexander's execution, he said something along the lines of, "We shall not take that road." Not grief, or not primarily grief. Calculation. His brother had tried to change Russia through individual acts of political violence, and it hadn't worked. There had to be a better method. The family's social standing in Simbirsk collapsed immediately. The brother of a convicted terrorist was not someone respectable local society associated with. Several families who had been friendly simply withdrew. One neighbor, a local official and father of a boy Vladimir had gone to school with, wrote a letter in support of Vladimir's university application anyway, a small act of decency in an ugly moment. That neighbor's son would later become famous in his own right. His name was Alexander Kerensky. He and Lenin would be on opposite sides of 1917. Vladimir applied to Kazan University to study law. He was accepted. He enrolled. Within 3 months, he was expelled for participating in a student demonstration. When asked later why he had joined the protest, he reportedly shrugged and said that there was nothing else to do. The other students were going, and it seemed like the right thing. An expulsion that the regional authorities reinforced by barring him from re-enrolling for some time. The irony, the son of a man who had devoted his life to building Russia's schools, now barred from attending them. He continued studying privately. He was eventually allowed to take his law examinations externally. He passed with the highest marks in his class. He went into legal practice briefly in Samara, but the law was never really the point. The intellectual center of his young adulthood was Marx. Karl Marx's Capital, dense, systematic, historical, polemical, had been circulating in Russian radical circles since the 1870s. Lenin first encountered Marx's work in his teens, and it did what a really persuasive intellectual framework does when it arrives at the right moment in a young mind. It organized everything. The apparent chaos of Russian society, the extremes of wealth and poverty, the indifference of the state, the suffering of workers and peasants, stopped being chaotic and started looking like a system with identifiable mechanisms. And systems with identifiable mechanisms can theoretically be changed. Marx's core argument was that capitalism contained within it the seeds of its own eventual destruction, that the exploitation of workers by those who owned the means of production would inevitably generate the conditions for revolution, and that history was moving, however slowly, however violently, toward a society in which class distinctions and the state itself would eventually dissolve. In 1893, Lenin moved to St. Petersburg, then the capital. He began organizing Marxist study groups with factory workers. A colleague who knew him at this time later recalled being startled by the directness of his manner. No small talk, no pleasantries. He would arrive at a meeting, open a notebook, and begin. He didn't waste a single word, the colleague wrote. You always had the feeling he had already thought further than everyone else in the room. He was arrested in December 1895. He spent 14 months in prison, which gave him time to read and write. He sent his family letters full of requests for specific books, organized by subject and author. He was sentenced to 3 years' exile in Siberia, standard practice for political dissidents of his era. The Tsarist government preferred exile over execution. It moved troublemakers without making martyrs. His posting was in a village called Shushenskoye, which by Siberian standards was relatively tolerable. He had books, he could correspond. His companion, Nadezhda Krupskaya, came to join him, and they married in 1898. Krupskaya deserves more than a footnote. She was a committed revolutionary in her own right, a theorist of education and Marxist politics, an organizational mind of real capability. She managed enormous amounts of correspondence for the movement and would continue doing so for decades. Volodya could write a pamphlet in a morning, she once observed, and by afternoon he had forgotten it. On to the next thing. My job was to remember. Their partnership worked because they were building the same thing and both knew it. When the exile ended in 1900, Lenin left Russia and didn't come back for 17 years. Western Europe, 1900 to 1917. Munich, London, Geneva, Paris, Krakow, Zurich, and places between. Those years in exile were not quiet. They weren't peaceful years of waiting. They were years of writing, arguing, organizing, fundraising, traveling to congresses, and navigating the fractious world of European socialist politics, a world where people who agreed on large things found remarkable energy to disagree on smaller ones. Lenin's personal circumstances during this period varied between modest and genuinely difficult. He and Krupskaya lived on what the party could scrape together and what they could earn from writing and translation work. A French socialist who visited them in Paris in 1909 described their apartment as containing a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books, mostly German, and a chess set. That was all. Lenin, he noted, seemed completely unbothered by this and immediately steered the conversation toward a dispute about trade union organizing strategy. He also had quite the temper and was very competitive with those around him. His polemical writing could be savage. He deployed ridicule and contempt as rhetorical weapons without obvious restraint, and some of his attacks on fellow socialists read even now as disproportionate to the actual stakes of the argument. The Menshevik leader, Julius Martov, who had been one of Lenin's closest friends, described receiving a pamphlet in which Lenin accused him of intellectual cowardice and political betrayal. "I read it twice," Martov wrote. "I could not find a single sentence that was not intended to wound. And what pained me most was that Volodya was mostly right." In 1902, Lenin published a pamphlet called What is to be Done. It laid out his vision of a vanguard party, not a broad, open membership organization, but a tight, disciplined core of professional revolutionaries who would provide leadership and direction to the working class. The working class, Lenin argued, left to its own devices, would develop trade union consciousness, the desire for better wages and conditions, but not necessarily revolutionary consciousness. That was the vanguard's job. Then came the Congress. In 1903, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party held a congress, first in Brussels, then moved to London when the Belgian authorities became nervous. What happened there split the party in ways it never recovered from. The split was officially about what qualified someone for party membership. Lenin's position was strict. Members had to be active participants in a party organization. The opposing position was looser. Membership could extend to anyone who worked under party direction. A delegate who was present later described the atmosphere. It was like watching 2 dogs fight over a bone neither of them had yet found. We argued for 3 weeks about party rules, and all the while Russia was burning. Lenin's faction briefly held a majority at the Congress, and the name stuck. Bolsheviks, from the Russian word for majority. The other group became the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks favored broad membership, cooperation with liberal reform movements, and a more gradualist path toward socialism. Lenin wanted something that could act. That argument would define the next 15 years. Meanwhile, Russia kept moving. January 1905. Soldiers in St. Petersburg opened fire on a peaceful march of workers heading to the Winter Palace to deliver a petition. They had brought their families. They had dressed carefully. The petition itself was not revolutionary. It asked the Tsar for basic labor protections and political representation, phrased in deferential terms. The troops fired anyway. Dozens died, possibly more than 100. A factory worker who survived the day wrote in his diary that evening, "We came in our Sunday clothes. We wanted him to see us as his children. He sent soldiers." The country erupted. General strikes, peasant land seizures, military mutinies, urban protests. The revolution of 1905 did not topple the Tsar, but it forced him to issue the October Manifesto, a promise of constitutional reform and an elected parliament, the Duma. Lenin came back to Russia for this. He watched events with the focused attention of someone trying to learn from everything that happened. When the revolution was suppressed and the brief constitutional moment began contracting, he left again. For the next 12 years, he worked. He wrote major theoretical works, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism in 1916, arguing that colonialism was not an accident of capitalist development, but a structural necessity of it. He argued with other socialists about the war when it came in 1914, taking a position sharply at odds with most European socialist parties who had voted to support their respective governments' war efforts. Lenin called the war an imperialist conflict serving the interests of ruling classes on both sides, and he called on workers of all nations to turn the war into a revolution. Most of the European left thought he was being reckless and unrealistic. His finances were often scarce, party fundraising was unreliable, there were scandals, a bank robbery in Tiflis in 1907, staged by the Bolshevik faction to generate funds, carried out by a figure named Stalin, who was then a relatively minor party operator in the Caucasus. The money was useful. The method was a preview. The Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, was extraordinarily effective at infiltrating revolutionary organizations. Some of Lenin's most trusted colleagues turned out to be informants. He wrote to Krupskaya from Paris in 1913, "I trust no one now. That is not pessimism. That is mathematics." By the winter of 1916, Europe had been at war for 2.5 years. The numbers are almost impossible to hold. The Russian army had suffered approximately 1.7 million combat deaths by 1917, with several times that number wounded, captured, or missing. Russia's industrial capacity was not equal to the demands of modern war. Ammunition shortages were chronic. Fuel was scarce. By late 1916, consumer prices had risen by something close to 400% compared to pre-war levels. Bread lines formed in Petrograd. Factory workers went on strike. A British diplomat stationed in the capital wrote home in December of that year, "The city feels like a body that has not yet been told it is dying." Tsar Nicholas II was not a cruel man. He was something more dangerous in a crisis. A man who was not equal to events and did not know it. He continued to believe that Russia would endure, that the army would hold, that loyalty to the alliance required continuing the war regardless of the cost. His court had become isolated, partly compromised by the influence of Rasputin, a mystic who had acquired extraordinary access to the imperial family because Nicholas's son had hemophilia and Rasputin appeared to be able to manage the boy's symptoms. Rasputin was murdered by aristocratic conspirators in December 1916. Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the conspirators, later described the killing in terms that made it sound almost comically difficult. Poison that didn't work, shots that didn't stop him. Whatever the truth of the story, one detail seems clear. Killing one eccentric mystic did nothing at all for the state of Russia. The rot was structural, not personal. In February 1917, early March by the standard European calendar, workers in Petrograd began striking and demonstrating over bread shortages. Soldiers ordered to suppress the demonstrations refused. Then they joined them. Nicholas received the news while at the military front. His generals advised him that the situation was unrecoverable. He abdicated on March 15, 1917. 304 years of Romanov rule ended on a train with a signature. A provisional government formed, mostly liberals and moderate socialists drawn from the Duma. They promised elections, they promised civil liberties, and they promised to continue the war. That last decision was the stone they tied around their own necks. Lenin was in Zurich when the news reached him. His landlady recalled that he came down to breakfast that morning looking strange, pale, distracted. He had read about the abdication in a newspaper left on a cafe table. He did not eat. He went upstairs, and she could hear him pacing. He was almost frantic to get home. The geography of the problem. Lenin was in neutral Switzerland, surrounded by countries at war with Russia, with no clear legal way to return. Britain and France, Russia's allies, were not interested in facilitating the return of an anti-war revolutionary who was openly calling for Russia to exit the conflict. The route through Germany was theoretically possible, but would require German cooperation, and publicly appearing to travel with German approval would provide his enemies with a permanent weapon. The German military was having its own conversation about exactly this situation. They were fighting a two-front war. If Russia could be destabilized, further destabilized since it was already unstable, Germany could potentially concentrate its full strength westward before American troops arrived in significant numbers. General Erich Ludendorff later admitted the reasoning was coldly pragmatic. We did not do it out of sympathy for the Russian workers. We did it because we needed Russia out of the war. The offer came through intermediaries. Germany would provide a sealed train carriage, extraterritorial as if it were a moving diplomatic enclave, to carry Lenin and a group of fellow exiles north through Germany, across the Baltic by ferry to Sweden, and then through Finland to Petrograd. The sealing of the carriage was Lenin's condition. He wanted it on record that he had not set foot on German soil, had not had contact with Germans during the crossing, was not traveling under German auspices in any meaningful sense. The Germans agreed immediately. They didn't care about the symbolism. Churchill would later write that Germany had transported Lenin like a plague bacillus in a sealed container, delivered into Russia's body. The image has stuck to the episode ever since, effective, as Churchill's images tended to be, and revealing about his frame of reference. Lenin as disease. Lenin as thing to be described epidemiologically rather than politically. Whether you find that framing instructive or reductive probably depends on your view of what happened next. On April 9, 1917, the train left Zurich's main station. About 100 Russian exiles had gathered on the platform to see them off. Not all of them were supportive. Some shouted, "Spies, German agents, traitors." The group on the train numbered somewhere between 30 and 32 people. As the train pulled away, Lenin reportedly turned to the person beside him and said that in 3 months they would either be swinging from gallows or they would be in power. He wasn't wrong about the timeline. The journey took roughly a week. Germany by rail, the Baltic by ferry to Sweden, Sweden to Finland, Finland to Petrograd. On the evening of April 16, 1917, the train arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd. There was a crowd on the platform, red banners, the sound of the Internationale, an armored car waiting outside. Nikolai Sukhanov, a socialist journalist who was present, described the scene in his memoirs. Lenin came, or rather burst into the crowd. His entrance into the station was triumphal in all outward appearances, but the content of his first speech left the Bolsheviks dumbfounded. Lenin descended from the train, stepped through the crowd, was lifted onto the armored car, and began to speak. And what he said over the coming days and weeks was utterly shocking to every Bolshevik who heard it. The April theses were 10 points published in the party newspaper shortly after Lenin's arrival. He had been composing them across the entire journey home, They amounted to a comprehensive repudiation of the cautious wait-and-see approach that the Bolshevik leadership had been taking toward the provisional government. All power to the Soviets. The Soviets were the local councils of workers and soldiers that had sprung up spontaneously during the February Revolution, direct descendants of similar structures from 1905. They were fractious, often chaotic, not obviously capable of governing a country of 150 million people. But they had real authority in the factories and the barracks, places where the provisional government had very little. Lenin wasn't interested in working within the existing political framework. He wanted to replace it. No support for the war. None. Not conditional, not qualified, not temporary. Immediate redistribution of land to the peasants, not after elections, not after a constituent assembly deliberated. Now. Several senior Bolsheviks were appalled. The party newspaper Pravda ran an editorial distancing itself from Lenin's position. Lev Kamenev wrote in print that Lenin's ideas were unacceptable insofar as they proceed from the assumption that the bourgeois democratic revolution is finished. Lenin did not adjust his position. He argued it at meetings, in print, in private conversations, with an absolute conviction that simply wore opposition down. One Bolshevik official who attended the debates wrote later, "Arguing with Lenin was like arguing with a man who had already read the end of the book. He was not cruel about it, he was patient, but he was completely certain." Within weeks, the April theses had essentially become official Bolshevik policy. The broader situation in Russia was accelerating in his direction. The provisional government launched a military offensive in June 1917, the June Offensive, with genuine hope that a Russian advance might restore army morale. The offensive collapsed catastrophically. Soldiers deserted by the tens of thousands. One officer wrote in his diary, "We ordered the advance. The men looked at us. Then they sat down." Whatever credibility the provisional government had with the military dissolved. In July, there were spontaneous demonstrations in Petrograd that came close to an insurrection. The Bolsheviks were blamed, and Lenin was forced to flee to Finland. He spent time hiding in a haystack. He wore a wig in public when necessary. It was, by any measure, not a dignified period. But September shifted things decisively. A general named Lavr Kornilov, perhaps with Kerensky's initial encouragement, perhaps acting on his own initiative, moved troops toward Petrograd in what looked like a right-wing coup. Kerensky, realizing what was happening, desperately reached for allies wherever he could find them. He turned to the Soviets, including the Bolsheviks. Bolshevik workers and soldiers helped organize resistance, dismantle rail lines, and persuade Kornilov's soldiers to stop marching. A soldier in Kornilov's column later described what happened when workers' delegations met them on the road. "They did not threaten us. They explained things. They told us who we were marching to protect and who we were marching against. By evening, we had all sat down." The coup collapsed. The Bolsheviks had just demonstrated their organizational capacity to all of Russia. Their popularity surged. By October, they held majorities in both the Petrograd Soviet and the Moscow Soviet. Lenin, still in Finland, was writing urgent letters to the party's Central Committee. "History will not forgive us," he wrote, "if we do not take power now." He sent letter after letter, increasingly insistent. At one point, he wrote that if the Central Committee would not act, he was prepared to go directly to the factory workers and agitate from below. The Central Committee was divided. Leon Trotsky, who had only joined the Bolsheviks in July but had rapidly become Lenin's most effective partner, argued for timing any move to coincide with the upcoming Second Congress of Soviets to give it a legitimizing frame. Lenin returned to Petrograd in disguise on the night of October 24th. He crossed the city in a wig with bandages on his face. The October Revolution was not what Soviet mythology later made it. the storming of the Winter Palace, the image that Sergei Eisenstein would cinematize decades later into something spectacular and heroic, was in reality a piecemeal, relatively quiet takeover. Bolshevik Red Guards moved out across Petrograd during the night of October 24th and into the early hours of October 25th. They occupied the telegraph offices, the train stations, the power stations, the telephone exchange. One by one, without significant resistance, the communications and logistics infrastructure of the city passed into Bolshevik hands. John Reed, the American journalist who was in Petrograd that night and would write about it in 10 Days That Shook the World, described walking through the city as it happened. On every corner, knots of soldiers, red guards at the bridges, armored cars moving slowly through the streets, and yet most of the city was asleep. The cafes were open. Somewhere a phonograph was playing. The provisional government was meeting in the Winter Palace and discovering that almost no one was coming to defend it. Kerensky borrowed a car from the American embassy and left the city, hoping to find loyal troops. He didn't find them. The Winter Palace fell when a small group of Red Guards simply walked in through a side entrance. The ministers of the provisional government were arrested politely and led away. Simultaneously, across town at the Smolny Institute, a former girls' school that had become the revolution's operational headquarters, the Second Congress of Soviets was convening. The Menshevik and socialist revolutionary delegates, watching what was happening outside, understood that they were witnessing a coup. They condemned it and walked out. Trotsky watched them go. "You are bankrupt," he told the departing delegates. "Your role is played out. Go where you belong, into the dustbin of history." With the opposition gone, the Congress ratified the transfer of power. Lenin stepped forward to address the room. Sukhanov, the journalist, was present again. His appearance provoked a stormy, endless ovation. When it subsided, Lenin said simply, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." The hall shook again. That night in that room was the point of no return. Whatever came next, and enormous, terrible things came next, the old order in Russia was finished. Holding power was a different problem from seizing it. The Bolsheviks had taken control of Petrograd in a single night. Russia was a country of roughly 150 million people, hundreds of ethnic groups, an enormous and fractious military, a mostly illiterate peasantry, and no functioning economy. The challenge of actually governing it turned out to be orders of magnitude harder than anything that had come before. Before October, Lenin had suggested, in a pamphlet called The State and Revolution, written in hiding in August and September 1917, that the administration of a socialist society would become so simple, so participatory, that any literate worker could manage it. "The state will begin to wither away," he had written, immediately after the revolution. What actually happened immediately was the opposite. The Bolsheviks found themselves building a state apparatus that was larger and more intrusive than the one they had replaced. The distance between the vision and the reality opened up almost immediately and never closed. The first major test was also the most painful decision Lenin made. The war with Germany had to end. The Russian army was not an army anymore. It was a collection of exhausted, disaffected men who had been fighting for 3.5 years. A soldier writing to his family in early 1918 put it with the directness of someone with nothing left to lose. "I don't know what we are fighting for anymore. I don't think the officers know either. I am coming home." In March 1918, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The terms were brutal. Russia surrendered Ukraine, Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, and portions of Belarus, enormous territories containing a significant fraction of the country's agricultural land and industrial capacity. The Bolshevik Party was furious. Trotsky had negotiated and initially rejected the terms. Others argued for continuing the war as a revolutionary struggle. Lenin was immovable. "I called it obscene," he said at the party congress. "I voted for it anyway. A bad peace is better than a good war when your army no longer exists." As it turned out, Germany's defeat in the West in November 1918, less than 8 months later, voided the treaty entirely. Broader military situation had been correct. But he couldn't have known that when he signed. It was a calculated gamble and it paid off, which is not the same as saying it was obviously right at the time. Then came the Civil War. It lasted from 1918 to 1921, and it nearly destroyed everything the October Revolution had produced. On one side, the Bolsheviks, the Reds, with the Red Army being rapidly built by Trotsky into a functional fighting force from almost nothing. On the other, the Whites, not a unified movement, but a coalition with almost nothing in common except opposition to the Bolsheviks. Monarchists, liberals, nationalist armies, and troops from more than a dozen foreign countries, including Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, who had intervened to support the White cause. The fighting was savage on all sides. Whole regions changed hands multiple times. Famine spread through areas disrupted by the fighting. Disease, typhus, cholera killed enormous numbers of people. During this period, Lenin sanctioned the Red Terror, systematic political violence against actual and suspected enemies of the revolution. The Cheka, the secret police established in December 1917 under Felix Dzerzhinsky, carried out executions of political opponents, former Tsarist officials, clergy, and anyone designated a class enemy. Dzerzhinsky himself described the task without any apparent discomfort. "We stand for organized terror. This should be said frankly." In August 1918, a socialist revolutionary named Fanny Kaplan shot Lenin at close range at a factory in Moscow. 2 bullets hit him. One lodged near his spine and was not removed until 1922. Eyewitnesses reported that after being shot, Lenin at first refused help, insisting on walking to his car unaided. Then collapsed. He survived, but the damage was lasting, and many historians believe his subsequent strokes were at least partly related to the wound. By 1920, the Civil War was winding toward a Bolshevik victory. The White armies had been defeated or scattered. Foreign interventions had been withdrawn. The revolution had survived, which was not a foregone conclusion. The cost was staggering. Industrial production had fallen to perhaps 20% of pre-war levels. Cities had emptied as people fled to the countryside to look for food. A famine relief worker traveling through the Volga region in 1921 wrote, "I have seen things this month that I will not describe. I will say only that the villages looked like villages I had read about in histories of the Black Death." And then Lenin did something that was, given his reputation, genuinely surprising. He admitted the economic policies had failed. The policy known as war communism, forced grain requisitioning from peasants, nationalization of essentially all industry, elimination of private trade, had kept the Red Army fed during the Civil War. It had also demolished the incentives of the agricultural economy. Peasants who had everything beyond subsistence confiscated stopped producing beyond subsistence. Agricultural output collapsed. Most ideologues of comparable conviction do not make this kind of admission. They find ways to explain the failure as someone else's sabotage or as a transitional difficulty requiring more intensity. Lenin could do this too, and sometimes did, but he was also capable of looking at results and revising, a quality that was real in him, whatever its source. In the spring of 1921, sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, men who had been among the most committed supporters of the October Revolution, rebelled. They demanded free Soviets, free elections, release of political prisoners. Their manifesto read, in part, "The Soviets no longer express the will of the workers. The present Soviets are not those for which we bled in the years of 1917 to 1918. The rebellion was crushed militarily by Red Army forces crossing the frozen Gulf of Finland. Several thousand people died. A Bolshevik official who participated in the assault later wrote in his memoirs that he had spent years trying to justify to himself what they had done. "These were our people," he wrote. "They believed in everything we said we believed in. I am not sure I have made peace with it." But Lenin drew a conclusion from it. The regime could not sustain itself against the peasantry. The peasantry was the vast majority of Russia. Some accommodation had to be made. The new economic policy, announced at the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, replaced forced grain requisitioning with a fixed tax. Peasants could sell surplus on the open market. Small-scale private enterprise was permitted. Limited capitalism in retail and light industry was tolerated, while the state retained control of major industries and infrastructure, what Lenin called the commanding heights. Some Bolsheviks felt as if the revolution had been reversed. Lenin's answer was characteristically blunt. "We are taking one step backward to take two steps forward. Anyone who cannot understand this is not thinking. They are reciting." Whether he truly believed a forward step was still coming, or whether he was already sensing that the gap between the revolutionary ideal and the reality of governing a vast, exhausted, predominantly peasant country might be permanent, we cannot know with certainty. What we know is that the new economic policy worked. Agricultural production began recovering. Famine eased. The cities stabilized. There is a quiet irony in the fact that the most economically productive period of the early Soviet state, the years of the new economic policy, roughly 1921 to 1928, was also the period most characterized by partial market freedom. The experiment ended when Stalin collectivized agriculture beginning in 1929, with catastrophic consequences. But during Lenin's lifetime, the NEP represented a grudging recognition that the workers' state could not simply command an economy into existence. Markets, even hated markets, carried information that plans could not replicate. Lenin knew this, or arrived at knowing it. His successors forgot it, or decided to ignore it, with consequences measured in millions of deaths. Then Lenin began to die. The first stroke came in May 1922. It affected his speech and his right side. He recovered enough to continue working, but his doctors were alarmed. The second, in December 1922, was more severe. Mobility and speech were substantially impaired. He moved from writing to dictation. The prodigious work capacity that had defined him, the ability to read everything, write continuously, manage ideological and organizational disputes simultaneously, was now constrained by a body that was failing faster than his mind could accept. Krupskaya described him in letters from this period with a restraint that somehow makes the situation more painful, not less. He works when he is allowed to. When he is not allowed, he looks out the window. In this period, dictating from what was effectively an enforced convalescence, he produced what became known as Lenin's Testament. Addressed to the next party congress, it assessed the leading figures of the Bolshevik party with the direct, sometimes withering judgment of a man who felt he was running out of time. About Stalin, he was most pointed. Joseph Stalin had been appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in April 1922. It seemed at the time like an administrative position, the kind of organizational role that someone competent and reliable could fill without it amounting to political power in the real sense. Stalin was competent. He was also accumulating something that went beyond administrative competence. Lenin saw it, or began to. In a postscript to his testament, written in January 1923, following an incident in which Stalin had been rude to Krupskaya on the telephone, Lenin wrote, "Stalin is too rude, and this fault, entirely supportable in dealings between us communists, becomes insupportable in the office of General Secretary." I propose to the comrades to find a way to remove Stalin from that position. The document was suppressed after Lenin's death. Stalin's hand was behind the suppression. On March 9, 1923, a third stroke rendered Lenin unable to speak. He lingered for nearly 10 months, cared for at the Gorky estate outside Moscow, unable to intervene in the power struggle that was already organizing itself around him. Krupskaya wrote to a friend, "He understands everything. He just cannot say it. Imagine what it is to be Volodya and not be able to say what you think." He died on January 21, 1924. He was 53 years old. His wife, Krupskaya, had asked that there be no elaborate memorialization. Lenin himself, by most accounts, had not wanted this either. Stalin overrode both. Lenin's body was embalmed and placed on permanent display in a mausoleum on Red Square in Moscow. It has remained there with some interruptions for a century. The Soviet Union that Lenin built lasted 69 years. It educated millions of people who had never had access to education. It built infrastructure across 11 time zones. It produced extraordinary scientists, writers, composers, and mathematicians. It also starved millions in the forced collectivization of the 1930s, sent millions more to die in the labor camps of the Gulag, and operated through a system of political terror that bore essentially no resemblance to anything Lenin had theorized before 1917. The question of whether Stalinism was the inevitable outcome of Leninism is one of the most argued questions in modern historical writing. There is no consensus, and there probably won't be. The case that it was inevitable runs roughly like this. Lenin built a one-party state. He suppressed rival socialist parties, the Mensheviks, the socialist revolutionaries, not just as political opponents, but as class enemies unfit to participate in governance. He established the Cheka, gave it extensive powers, and used it to bypass legal procedure when he judged it necessary. He created a political culture in which the party's judgment was treated as equivalent to historical truth, in which deviation from the party line was not merely incorrect but morally suspect. Trotsky, who had himself been complicit in all of this, wrote in Exile in the 1930s with some bitterness, "We built the house. Stalin chose to live in it differently than we intended, but we built it." The case that it was not inevitable runs roughly like this. Most political systems contain within them the possibility of more extreme versions of themselves. The existence of structural vulnerabilities does not make the worst outcomes inevitable. They require specific actors making specific choices in specific circumstances. Stalin was not an automatic product of Leninism. He was a person with a particular psychology who used Leninist institutions for purposes that went beyond anything Lenin had built them for. Both arguments contain real insight. Neither is fully satisfying. What most serious historians do agree on is that the October Revolution was neither a pure expression of popular will nor a simple coup by a minority against a majority. It was something more complicated, a seizure of power by an organized minority at a moment of extraordinary instability, claiming to act in the name of a majority whose actual preferences were far from unified. The Civil War, the Red Terror, the suppression of rival socialist parties, the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in January 1918, after the Bolsheviks lost the only genuinely free national elections Russia would hold for decades, all of these happened under Lenin's direction. They are not marginal details. They are central to any honest accounting of what the October Revolution actually was. At the same time, the Russia of 1917 was not a just or humane order defending itself against unjust change. It was a country where the gap between the richest and the most desperate was extreme by any measure, where the war had been imposed on people who had no voice in it. The revolution happened in a context and judging it without that context is its own kind of historical error. History lives between those two positions, and it has no interest in resolving the discomfort. The alternate history questions are worth sitting with for a moment because they illuminate something real. What if the German High Command had decided the risk was too great, that sending Lenin to Russia might produce unpredictable consequences? Lenin remains in Switzerland. The Bolsheviks in Petrograd, without his voice insisting on immediate seizure of power, continue on a more cautious trajectory. The provisional government gains a few more months. Maybe it consolidates. Maybe it collapses anyway under the weight of the war and some other force fills the vacuum. No one really knows. What if Lenin hadn't been shot in August 1918? The Fanny Kaplan assassination attempt almost certainly shortened his life. Without it, he might have lived into the late 1920s. He had already put on record in his testament that Stalin should be removed from power. A healthier Lenin, present during the succession struggle of the mid-1920s, might have been able to enforce that recommendation. Forced collectivization, the Great Terror, the systematic murder of the party's own old guard. All of this might have been different. Would Lenin's version of the Soviet Union have been better? Probably, in comparative terms. But better is doing heavy work there. He was not a gentleman. He ordered executions. He authorized terror. The structural elements he built, the one-party state, the secret police, the political suppression of opposition, contained within them the machinery that Stalin would later expand to catastrophic scale. A longer-lived Lenin would likely have kept the new economic policy alive, maintained a more mixed economy, probably prevented the worst excesses of the 1930s. He almost certainly would not have opened the political system in any meaningful way. These remain speculation. They are useful speculation because they remind us that history was not inevitable. It is made by specific people in specific moments, and particular choices matter. The last years of Lenin's life produced some writing that cuts differently from his theoretical and organizational work. He was alarmed, genuinely alarmed, by the bureaucratization he was watching in the party and the state. The Soviet government had absorbed enormous numbers of former Tsarist officials simply because it needed people who knew how to run things. He wrote in 1923 that the Soviet state was like a car being driven by a driver who intends one direction but goes wherever the road leads. "Who leads whom?" he asked, dictating from his sickbed. "I am no longer certain." His wife Krupskaya survived him by 15 years. She spent much of that time trying to preserve what she believed Lenin had actually stood for, against a party apparatus that was systematically distorting it for Stalin's political purposes. She succeeded only partially, but it was a faithful effort. When she attempted, at a party congress, to read aloud the testament in which Lenin had recommended removing Stalin from power, she was shouted down. She sat down. She kept her seat. The sealed train eventually ended up in a museum. It has been moved, displayed, argued over. At the Finland station, in what is now called St. Petersburg again, the city went back to its original name after 1991. There is a statue of Lenin outside the building. He stands with one arm extended, reaching forward or pointing somewhere, depending on your angle. On grey winter mornings, the statue collects frost. The city moves around it. The global consequences of 1917 are almost impossible to fully measure. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, still at war when the October Revolution happened, the Bolshevik example became both an inspiration for the left and a warning for conservatives. Genuine revolutionary situations developed in Germany and Hungary in 1918 and 1919. Both were suppressed. Rosa Luxemburg, the German socialist leader who was killed in the crackdown of 1919, had written of the Russian example with a complexity that even many of her allies found uncomfortable. The Bolsheviks have shown that a socialist party can seize power. They have not yet shown that it can exercise it without consuming itself. In France and Britain, labor movements that had been broadly supporting the war effort became more restive as the Russian example made clear that governments could be overthrown. The political settlements in Western Europe after 1918, the expanded social programs, the concessions to organized labor were not made purely from generosity. They were made partly because of what had happened in Russia and what might happen elsewhere. In the United States, the reaction was predominantly hostile. American troops participated in the Allied intervention in Russia, a fact that is not especially prominent in American historical memory, but that had a durable effect on how Soviet leaders understood the relationship between Russia and the West. The intervention reinforced a sense within Bolshevik leadership of being surrounded by hostile powers determined to strangle the revolution before it could consolidate. The Cold War, which consumed the second half of the 20th century, shaped the course of dozens of national histories, produced the threat of nuclear annihilation, and organized the geopolitical map of the world, was in a very direct sense the continuation of the confrontation that began in 1917. Two visions of how human society should be organized, facing each other across 4 decades in a conflict that claimed to be about ideology but was never only about ideology. All of that traces back to a decision made in Berlin by German military officials who thought they were playing a contained strategic game to put a Russian revolutionary on a train. What remains at the end of all of this? Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born in a provincial town on the Volga, the son of a man who had climbed from serfdom, the younger brother of a man who was hanged. He spent the better part of his adult life in exile, cold rented rooms in Munich and London and Geneva and Zurich, fighting arguments that seemed like they would never resolve, watching Russia from a distance, waiting with the particular patience of someone who is not actually patient but has no other choice. He came home on a Tuesday in April 1917. Within 7 months he had toppled a government, restructured a state, and committed the largest country on earth to an experiment in social organization that had never been tried before at scale. He died at 53. His body was put on display against the wishes of the people who had known him best. The monument to him that exists is not the mausoleum, really. It is the argument about what his life meant, what the revolution he made accomplished and what it destroyed, what his methods produced beyond what he intended them to produce. That argument is still active. It appears in academic journals and in political speeches and in ordinary conversations in countries that were once part of the Soviet bloc and in countries that were never close to it. There is something worth acknowledging about the quality of the life itself, separate from the ideological accounting. Lenin worked. He worked with a single-mindedness that is almost alien from the ordinary human experience of being pulled in multiple directions, distracted, ambivalent. He read everything, he wrote continuously, he argued every position until it was either defeated or adopted. Maxim Gorky, the Russian writer who knew him personally and had complicated feelings about him, wrote after Lenin's death, "I know of no one else who could hate so unsparingly, with such a cold and burning force, everything that was ugly in human beings, and I know of no one else who loved people so much. Whether those two things are contradictory, or whether they are, in certain natures, the same thing, Gorky did not say. The desire that drove him, for a world where the accident of birth does not determine the limits of a life, where the resources of civilization are not concentrated in the hands of those who happen to be born into ownership, that desire was real and it was not small. It is, in various forms, one of the most persistent desires in recorded human history. The form Lenin gave that desire was not adequate to it. The methods he used created new injustices alongside the ones he was trying to eliminate. the historical moment proved far more complicated than any single theory could contain. None of that makes the desire illegitimate. None of it makes the questions go away. You are living in the long aftermath of what happened in April and October 1917. The world that was shaped by the Cold War, by the spread of socialist and communist movements across the 20th century, by the particular form of capitalism that emerged in the decades after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, all of that is part of the context within which the present moment exists. History does not announce itself when it is happening. It becomes visible in retrospect, in the shapes it leaves behind. Lenin left behind an enormous shape. He was brilliant and ruthless and genuinely motivated by something beyond personal ambition, and the state that emerged from his revolution committed crimes on a scale that cannot be explained away or balanced against achievements. Both of those things are true, and neither cancels the other. That's what complicated historical figures are, not puzzles that, once solved, yield a clean verdict. People who acted in the world and left it permanently altered in ways that mix the admirable and the terrible so thoroughly that separating them is probably not the right project. Understanding them is. Tonight you have stayed with a complicated life and not required it to simplify itself. That is its own form of intellectual honesty, and it matters. Settle now. The story has done what stories can do, traced a shape, given some texture to something that was once abstract, left some things unresolved because they are genuinely unresolved. The sealed train, the Finland station, the night in October, the failing body, the frozen statue in a city that has renamed itself. History is still moving. Good night.